marble floors and mocking laughter. I still remember the smell of polished marble that first morning, cold, sharp, and expensive. The kind of smell that makes you stand a little straighter, afraid to breathe too loudly. I was 19, clutching a borrowed mop, standing in the grand foyer of the mansion like a misplaced shadow. My shoes squeaked, and the sound echoed up to the chandelier. Then came her voice, sharp as the click of her heels. "Careful, girl. Don't leave streaks on the floor." The girl. That's what they called me for 2 years. Not by name, not even by the maid. Just the girl. I sometimes wondered if I went missing, would they even notice? Or would they just assume the mop had learned to move itself? Back then, I still believed in those cheap little dreams, saving money, going to school, changing my life. Looking back, it's almost adorable. There I was, scrubbing marble floors while secretly imagining walking down red carpets. Turns out imagination is the only luxury the poor get for free. That house was a universe made of glass and silence. White walls, glittering chandeliers, and laughter that bounced off the ceilings like small, cruel bells. Everyone moved as if the air itself were made to serve them. Once, I overheard the young master joke to a friend, "She looks at the staircase like she wants to marry the house." I didn't laugh. But later, washing my hands in the cold sink, I smiled and whispered to my reflection, "Maybe I do." I knew I didn't belong there, but something in the marble reflections kept me looking. Every tile was like a tiny mirror, and in each one, I saw a different version of myself, one that didn't bow. At night, after everyone had gone to sleep, I liked to walk quietly down the hallways, barefoot, my mop long put away. The air conditioning whispered against my skin. I imagined the soft click of high heels, not rubber slippers. My shadow stretched tall on the walls, and for a moment, I could almost believe it belonged to someone powerful. One evening, while dusting the sitting room, the young master said, "You clean like you're polishing a museum. Maybe someday you'll own one." I replied softly, "Maybe." The room went still. Then came the laughter, loud, bright, and unforgettable. Funny thing is, they were right. I learned how to be invisible and precise, polishing mirrors without leaving fingerprints, serving tea without a ripple, listening to conversations I wasn't supposed to hear. I became the most well-trained shadow in that house. But when you live long enough in darkness, you start noticing where the light leaks in. Every morning I'd see their cars glide past the gate, smooth engines, tinted windows, that quiet hum of wealth. I told myself, one day, I'll sit inside one of those, not to run away, but to come back. One rainy afternoon, I overheard the lady of the house snapping into her phone, "This place isn't for dreamers. People born in the basement should stay there." I said nothing, but a spark lit up quietly inside me. After that I started paying attention who called whom, what papers were hidden in drawers, which Singapore meetings were actually weekend affairs. I wasn't planning revenge, not yet. I was studying the system, learning where the power truly lived. At night, under a dim yellow bulb, I kept a notebook. I wrote simple things. Tomorrow, learn 2 new English words. I didn't know why I was doing it, but something in me knew language was a key, one I'd need to unlock a higher floor. Then I wrote another line. Don't let their laughter be the soundtrack of your life. And so I kept scrubbing. But it wasn't just cleaning anymore. It was training. Every glossy reflection felt like a tiny medal I was earning. Someday, I'd hang them all up on the walls of my home. I just didn't know yet whose home it would be. The rules of servitude. There are no manuals for being a maid in a mansion, but there might as well have been. Rule number 1. Never look too long at anything expensive. Rule number 2. When they laugh, you smile, but never for real. And rule number 3. Know your place. It sounds simple until you realize your place shifts depending on who's in the room. By my 3rd month, I could tell who was walking down the hallway just by the rhythm of their steps. Mrs. Beaumont, my employer, moved like a songbird that had learned to fly indoors, fast, fluttering, and always one heartbeat away from scolding someone. Her husband, Mr. Beaumont, walked like a man carrying invisible trophies, chin up, chest out, confidence stitched into every stride. And their son? He drifted through the house like a ghost with Wi-Fi, always connected, never present. I was the silent punctuation between their sentences, the pause between arguments, the invisible proof that their lives were grand enough to afford staff. Some nights, I'd stand by the window while they dined, the sound of silverware tinkling like little bells. I used to imagine what it felt like to taste food that didn't come from leftovers, to drink wine that wasn't poured from a box. But mostly, I studied them, how they smiled differently depending on who they talked to, how Mrs. Beaumont's laugh would rise an octave when she wanted to impress someone. I was learning, and not just how to serve. Don't get ideas above your station, the butler once told me. He was an old man who had been there longer than any of them. His hands trembled when he poured tea, but his voice was steady. You can polish the silver all your life, girl, but it'll never belong to you. I looked at the silver tray between us, and I saw his reflection next to mine. Maybe not, I said quietly, but it'll remember me. He chuckled, shaking his head. You're trouble, I can tell. Maybe, I said, but polite trouble. I didn't know it then, but that line, polite trouble, would carry me further than any diploma. The mansion was a school for me, though the subjects were unusual. I learned negotiation by listening through half-closed doors. I learned psychology by watching dinner parties. I learned branding by observing how Mrs. Beaumont's tone changed depending on the jewelry she wore. Every lesson came disguised as a task. And still, there were moments of quiet humiliation, the kind that left no bruise but lingered like a scent. One morning, Mrs. Beaumont handed me a silk scarf and said, "Try not to get your hands oily on it." I wanted to tell her that my hands had washed her sheets, her dishes, even the marble she liked to brag about, that maybe they deserved a little oil. Instead, I just said, "Yes, ma'am," and folded it carefully. Because sometimes survival sounds exactly like obedience. There was a pattern to the days: polish, serve, vanish. I'd wake before dawn, the sky still gray, and feel the cool marble under my feet, a reminder that I was standing on someone else's dream. But even then, part of me refused to believe it would stay that way. Once, while cleaning the library, I ran my fingers along the bookshelves, tracing the golden letters on the spines. Finance, architecture, marketing. I didn't understand most of it, but I loved how the words looked: heavy, confident, powerful. That night, I copied down titles into my notebook, determined to find out what they meant someday. The house wasn't just full of luxury, it was full of information, and I was the only one small enough to move through it unnoticed. That, I realized, was my superpower. Still, the silence of servitude can be heavy. There were nights I lay awake in my tiny room by the laundry hall, listening to the faint hum of the mansion. It was alive, breathing through the vents, whispering secrets I couldn't quite catch. Sometimes I wondered if the house remembered all the people who'd worked here before me, the maids, the cooks, the gardeners, or if it just absorbed them like spilled wine on a rug. But the marble floors always reflected me back. Maybe that was the house's quiet promise. I see you. So I kept learning the rules, but I also learned how to bend them. I started timing my cleaning so I could overhear calls in the office. I made small talk with the delivery drivers to learn about the business side of the family, and every time they told me I didn't belong, I thought, not yet. One afternoon, while polishing the grand staircase, the young master looked down at me and smirked. "You know," he said, "people like you make this house beautiful, but you'll never sit upstairs." I looked up at him, light bouncing off the marble between us. "Then I guess I'll just have to buy the house." He laughed, a short, disbelieving laugh, the kind you give a joke you think you'll never see punchline to. But that laugh, like the scent of marble polish, stayed with me, because someday I knew he'd hear it again. Cracks in the marble. It started with a sound, a crack, faint but sharp, like a whisper breaking a promise. I was wiping down the grand stair rail when I heard it. The marble under my rag felt slightly uneven. For a moment, I thought it was my imagination, but when I leaned closer, there it was, a hairline fracture, barely visible, but they're all the same. That's the thing about marble. No matter how polished, how flawless it looks, time always finds a way in. And people are no different. The Beaumont's perfection had always felt staged, like a reality show filmed on silent mode. But lately, I started noticing little things. Mr. Beaumont stopped wearing his wedding ring. Mrs. Beaumont's afternoon charity events stretched past midnight. The young master's car wasn't parked in the garage anymore, but at the club across town. The marble was cracking, not just under my mop, but in their lives. One morning, I was asked to dust the study, a room usually locked. Mr. Beaumont had rushed out early, leaving the door slightly ajar. My job was simple: clean and get out. But curiosity has a way of pulling at people who've been invisible too long. The desk was a landscape of chaos: papers, whiskey stains, and an envelope half tucked beneath a file. The name on the letterhead wasn't Beaumont Industries. It was a bank, and the numbers printed on the page didn't look good. Debt. I didn't understand all the financial jargon, but I recognized desperation when I saw it. The mighty Beaumonts were crumbling, and no one outside the gates knew. I tucked the letter back exactly where it was and went back to dusting, pretending my heart wasn't racing. Because that tiny crack of knowledge, that secret, felt powerful, dangerous even. That night, as I folded sheets in the laundry room, I whispered to myself, even marble breaks, and it became my quiet mantra. Over the next few weeks, the tension grew thicker than the perfume Mrs. Beaumont wore. Voices raised behind closed doors. The butler started forgetting things, maybe from age, or maybe from fear. The house began to feel like a stage after the audience had gone home, the lights still on, but everyone tired of pretending. Once, while dusting the upstairs hallway, I overheard an argument through the bedroom door. You promised the investors, and you promised not to max out the cards. I did it for us, or for your image. Silence followed. The kind of silence that doesn't end, it just changes form. That night, I wrote in my notebook, power isn't about who owns the house. It's about who knows what's happening inside it. I started noticing patterns in the mail, invoices, and deliveries. Mrs. Beaumont ordered fewer flowers, fewer designer boxes arrived at the gate. Even the food deliveries got smaller. The chef complained that the menu's gone on a diet. Meanwhile, I was saving every coin I could. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I hid the money inside a hollow floorboard under my bed, a secret within a secret. And then something happened that changed everything. One evening, as I was collecting laundry, I found a small notebook in the young master's jacket pocket. I shouldn't have opened it, but curiosity has its own gravity. Inside were sketches, numbers, and one name repeated several times: Greystone Holdings. Later, I heard him arguing on the phone. I don't care what my father says, I'm selling the shares. That company's a sinking ship. That was when I realized the Beaumont empire wasn't just cracked, it was collapsing. I didn't feel pity, not exactly. Maybe a little sadness, like watching a painting fade from sunlight. But mostly, I felt something else: readiness. Because when marble crumbles, the dust that falls can be used to build something new. And I wasn't going to waste mine. I began reading every newspaper I could find, clipping articles about real estate markets and anything that smelled like power. Sometimes the chauffeur would leave his financial pages behind, and I'd sneak them into my apron pocket. Every night, I'd sound out the hard words aloud: assets, equity, investment, ownership. Ownership. The word rolled around my tongue like a secret candy. Sweet, dangerous, addictive. By now, I knew the Beaumonts better than they knew themselves. I knew who they pretended to be and who they really were when no one was watching. One night, as Mrs. Beaumont walked past me on the stairs, she stopped suddenly and looked down. You've been here a while now, haven't you? Yes, ma'am. Don't get too comfortable. Her heels clicked away. I smiled after her. Don't worry, I whispered. I won't. The crack in the marble spread over time, invisible but certain. And just like that floor, the family's shine began to dull, one secret at a time. By the time the first piece broke off completely, I was ready to catch it. The whisper of ambition. Ambition doesn't roar, at least, not at first. It starts as a whisper, the kind that slips in when the house goes quiet. Mine began somewhere between midnight and 2 a.m. in that small attic room above the laundry hall where the walls sweated in summer and the pipes groaned in winter. While the mansion slept, I studied. It started with borrowed things, newspapers left behind by the driver, the son's old business textbooks, even the glossy brochures they tossed into the trash after meetings. I'd fish them out and wipe off the crumbs of caviar. And under that dim yellow bulb that flickered like a dying star, I sounded out words that tasted foreign but powerful. Equity, collateral, capital. They became my bedtime prayers. Some nights, I'd whisper them into the dark, rolling each syllable on my tongue like a secret spell. I figured if I couldn't own anything yet, I could at least own knowledge. There's a strange power in learning quietly while others sleep. It's like building a bridge in the fog. They can't see it, but someday you'll cross it, and they'll wonder how you got there. During the day, I was still the maid, polite, invisible, the perfect ghost in uniform. But at night, I was someone else, a silent architect, mapping my escape. The first book I finished was a self-help guide that Mrs. Beaumont's sister left behind after a visit. It had a ridiculous title, The Mindset of Millionaires. She'd barely opened it. I devoured it cover to cover in 2 nights. It said things like success begins with belief. I thought, that's cute. But it also said, your surroundings shape your limits. That one hit harder. Because my surroundings were marble, and I was the one polishing it. So I started shaping my limits differently. I saved a little more from my wages, stopped buying sweets, and instead spent what I could on used English books from a street vendor. I'd pretend to be cleaning the study but secretly typed words into the office computer, translating articles. I even learned to write emails, short, sharp, polite. One night, the butler caught me reading. Up late again, girl, he muttered, adjusting his glasses. Yes, sir. He eyed the finance book in my lap. What good will that do you? I smiled. Maybe none now. Maybe everything later. He chuckled softly. Dreamers like you, dangerous breed. He wasn't wrong. Over time, my notebook filled with plans, small and steady plans, but they were mine. I wrote, Step 1, learn how money moves. Step 2, learn how people move. Step 3, be where they least expect you to be. And slowly, something inside me began to shift. The house no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a classroom. Every insult became a lecture, every dinner party, a business case study. I watched the guests arrive, how they complimented each other's jewelry while measuring each other's weakness. I learned that power often hides behind kindness. One afternoon, Mrs. Beaumont's friend, a real estate agent, stopped by. While serving tea, I overheard her say, if you can buy when others panic, you'll own the city someday. That line stayed with me for years. I wrote it down and underlined it twice. Meanwhile, the Beaumont family's cracks were deepening. The arguments grew louder. The son stopped coming home altogether. Even the gardeners whispered about layoffs. And me? I was invisible, which meant I was safe. I kept my head down and my ears open. I started noticing opportunities, like little constellations only I could see. One of the delivery men mentioned a property sale downtown, cheap, nearly abandoned. I asked him questions, careful not to sound too curious. He shrugged and gave me a flyer. I hid it inside my notebook, heart racing. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, tracing the future in my mind. I didn't have enough money to buy a single brick, but I had a map forming, and that was a start. I imagined walking through my own doorway someday. No uniform, no orders. The air warm, the walls mine. I'd still mop the floors, but this time, each stroke would sing. Sometimes I laughed quietly to myself, not the way Mrs. Beaumont laughed, sharp and rehearsed, but the kind of laugh that comes when you realize your story isn't over yet. I started greeting the house differently in the mornings. Good morning, beautiful. I'd whisper to the marble as I wiped it. You'll be mine someday. If anyone had heard me, they would have called it madness. But I knew better. Ambition always sounds like madness at first, because before it roars, it whispers. And that whisper was getting louder every night. When the mansion burned, it didn't begin with fire. It began with silence. That strange, heavy silence that hangs in the air when something has already gone wrong. You just don't know it yet. It was late autumn, and the house smelled of cinnamon candles and quiet panic. Mr. Beaumont was making more phone calls than usual, pacing the study with his tie loosened. Mrs. Beaumont had stopped hosting her charity lunches. Even the staff walked softer, like the floor itself might break under the wrong sound. And then came the night everything changed. I was folding towels when I heard shouting. It started upstairs, sharp, brittle voices slicing through the halls. Then a crash, then another. I froze, clutching a towel like a shield. Through the thin walls, words flew like arrows. You've ruined us. You spent everything on that ridiculous project. I built this family. You built an illusion. Then came the sound of glass breaking. Silence followed, the kind that isn't peaceful, just empty. By morning, Mr. Beaumont was gone. His car, his watch, his suit all gone. Only the echo of his cologne lingered in the hallway. The mansion felt hollow, like it had been unplugged from its own power source. Mrs. Beaumont didn't cry, not that I saw. She just ordered everyone around as if the structure of commands could hold her together. But there was something wild behind her eyes, like she was talking to ghosts that didn't listen anymore. Within a week, the bankers came. They arrived in gray suits, speaking softly, but with the precision of knives. I served them coffee, and while they talked numbers and terms like liquidation, I stood in the background, pretending to be furniture. But I understood enough. The house was in danger. The Beaumont fortune, the marble, the chandeliers, the cars, was smoke and mirrors. And now the smoke was thinning. I remember standing in the grand foyer that evening, staring up at the chandelier that had once blinded me with its light. For the first time, I noticed dust gathering on the crystals. I thought, even stars collect dust when they fall. Over the next month, the mansion began to unravel. Servants were let go one by one. The chef first, then the gardener, then the driver. The butler retired, or perhaps fled. When it came down to me, Mrs. Beaumont simply sighed. I can't afford to keep everyone. I nodded. Of course, ma'am, but she didn't let me go. Not yet. Maybe because I was the only one who never asked questions. Or maybe because she needed someone to witness her not falling apart. The day it happened, the real fire started quietly. It was storm season, and lightning rolled across the sky like camera flashes. Mrs. Beaumont had been drinking, a habit she'd once called a glass of courage. I was in the kitchen, watching the rain streak down the windows, when I smelled smoke. At first, I thought it was from the fireplace, but when I turned, I saw it, a ribbon of dark gray curling along the ceiling, soft and sinister. Mrs. Beaumont? I called. No answer. I ran upstairs, and there it was. The drapes in the study had caught fire, probably from one of her candles left too close. The flames spread fast, greedy, dancing up the walls. I grabbed the fire extinguisher, my hands shaking, my heart thundering like the storm outside. By the time the firemen arrived, the damage was done, the room blackened, the paintings curled into ghosts of color. Mrs. Beaumont sat outside in her robe, mascara streaked like melted glass. She didn't speak. When the firefighters asked what happened, she just whispered, "It's all gone anyway." But not everything was gone. Amid the ashes, I found something, a half-burned file, edges still warm. Inside, property deeds, loan records, and one name that stood out like a lifeline, Greystone Holdings. The same name I'd seen months ago in her son's notebook. I tucked it under my coat before anyone noticed. That night, as the rain hissed against the smoldering house, I sat in my little attic room, clutching that file. Outside, the mansion steamed like a dying beast. Inside, my heart was calm. The house that once looked eternal had burned, but I wasn't afraid. I'd spent years polishing marble floors, I knew that beneath every shine, there's grit. When I closed my eyes, I could still hear the crackle of fire, but beneath it, something else, the faint hum of possibility. I wasn't sure how yet, but I knew this. I would not go down with the mansion. I would rise with the smoke. Maybe the house was never meant to be my prison. Maybe it was meant to be my forge. Deals and dust. When the dust settled, both literally and figuratively, I stepped into a world that felt strange and familiar all at once. The mansion still stood, albeit scarred, a skeleton of its former glory. The chandelier hung crooked, the floors bore black streaks, but somehow it looked honest. For the first time, I didn't feel like a shadow. The bankers were still there, and for once, I was allowed to speak. My voice was soft but steady. I watched the conversation between them and Mrs. Beaumont nodding, filing details away like precious coins. I realized that deals weren't fought with anger or shouting. Deals were fought with numbers, patience, and attention, things a maid, unnoticed for so long, could master perfectly. I had saved my pennies, learned a few tricks, and made quiet contacts during my years of servitude. Now, I began quietly acquiring small properties, undervalued plots in neighborhoods that no one else noticed. I listened to real estate podcasts while scrubbing toilets, laughing silently at the irony that my empire's foundation started among soapy water. I remember joking with myself one evening as I sorted through spreadsheets by candlelight, from mop to million-dollar plots. Who'd have thought? The words made me chuckle, a soft, self-amused sound that blended with the hum of the old pipes. The Beaumonts, meanwhile, were floundering. Their debts, once hidden behind marble walls and polite laughter, were now creeping into every phone call and letter. The young master had disappeared entirely, probably hiding from the numbers, the losses, or perhaps the truth. Mrs. Beaumont attempted to negotiate, but panic crept into her voice, a subtle tremor I'd never heard before. I watched quietly, always in the background, learning how negotiations bent under pressure. One lesson was clear: people reveal their weaknesses when they think you don't notice. I did notice, and I kept track. Every slight hesitation, every forced smile, I wrote it down. My first real breakthrough came with a small plot that no one else cared about. It was ugly, overlooked, and half abandoned. Perfect. I negotiated fiercely, learned patience in silence, and walked away with the deed. My hands trembled slightly as I held it, not from fear, but from the thrill of finally holding something that no one could take from me. I was still careful, still polite, still the ghost that cleaned the floors during the day. But I was no longer the girl who waited. I was the girl who acted. And every small acquisition, every carefully whispered deal, added a brick to my invisible ladder. The mansion itself became my secret classroom. I would study the flaws left by the fire, estimate repairs, and dream of turning it into something greater. It was a challenge and an opportunity, and I loved it. One evening, I whispered to the broken chandelier, "Just you wait, old friend. We'll shine again, but on my terms." I laughed quietly at the thought. "Polite trouble," I muttered, remembering the butler's words. He had no idea how accurate that description would become. Months turned into years. Each small victory felt monumental. The old staff had long disappeared. Mrs. Beaumont had retreated into herself, her laughter a faint echo. And I, still seemingly invisible, was quietly assembling an empire from dust and ambition. Sometimes I'd allow myself a private smirk. There was something delicious about being underestimated, about the contrast between who they thought I was and who I had become. It was like watching someone trip over their own marble floors silently, elegantly, without ever needing to speak. The world, I'd learned in whispers and shadows, was finally opening its doors. But I still moved carefully, as if the house itself might scold me for being too ambitious. After all, marble remembers. And I wasn't about to disappoint it. In the quiet evenings, I'd sit in my small attic room, listening to the rain against the roof. The smell of wet stone mixed with candle wax, comforting and familiar. I felt the tiniest shiver of pride. Every small deal, every tiny purchase, every whispered phone call. It was building towards something far bigger. And deep down, I knew it wouldn't just be about property or numbers or even revenge. It would be about reclaiming what was always mine: dignity, control, and a story only I could tell. The mansion waited, patient, scarred, and wise. And I was ready to step out from behind the mop and take my place. A seat at the table 5 years later, I walked back into the mansion as if it were a familiar stage, only now, I wasn't the ghost in the corners. I had a name, a plan, and enough quiet power to make people notice without raising my voice. The family's fortune had splintered, their empire in disarray. Mrs. Beaumont barely recognized the rhythm of her own halls, and the young master had vanished entirely. But the mansion, my old battlefield, still stood. Its scars whispered secrets I now understood. I entered through the main doors, polished shoes replacing slippers, notebook tucked under my arm. The butler, older now, raised an eyebrow. He knew me, of course, but he didn't speak. Some recognition doesn't require words. Dinner was set as if nothing had changed. Silverware gleamed, wine caught the chandelier light, and the air smelled faintly of rosemary and apprehension. The family sat stiffly, aware that something was different, though they couldn't quite say what. I took a seat at the table, not at the end, but at a side that forced them to acknowledge me. There was a pause, that quiet hush of recognition, as if the air itself shifted. "You've changed," Mrs. Beaumont said carefully, a trace of wonder and irritation in her voice. I smiled. "Time teaches," I said softly, "and sometimes fire helps too." The young master had returned briefly, not fully, just enough to witness. But I could see in his eyes the shock of seeing the girl who once cleaned marble floors now occupying a place of quiet authority. It was amusing, really, how little one had to do to make them understand the change. I had studied negotiation, investments, human behavior, and patience. I had learned how to listen for the gaps in speech, how to recognize when a hand trembles even under a suit, how to make the subtle pause carry more weight than an argument. All that knowledge finally had its stage. During dinner, I made small suggestions, tiny interjections about investments and repairs. Everyone leaned in, some skeptically, some with curiosity. And for the first time, they realized the girl they had ignored had not only learned their language, but had mastered it better than they had expected. The chandelier above me shimmered, fractured crystals catching the candlelight. I thought of the night it almost burned down. Then softly, I whispered to myself, "We'll shine again." I kept my tone gentle, almost casual, letting the authority creep in naturally. I knew patience would be my most elegant weapon. The house itself seemed to approve, creaking faintly as if stretching after a long sleep. The conversations flowed, financial discussions, repair estimates, even a few pointed questions about my acquisitions in the city. I answered with calm precision. I didn't need to brag. The numbers spoke, the presence spoke, and sometimes I allowed myself a private smirk at the irony. The very people who had once called me the girl were now listening, hanging on the edges of my words, because I had quietly become indispensable. Later, as the candles burned low, I excused myself, walking through the halls, now mine in spirit, if not yet on paper. I noticed how different the marble felt under my shoes. Softer? Maybe. Or perhaps it just recognized the owner it had waited for all these years. I paused before the grand staircase, letting my hand glide along the rail. Memories of scraping dirt, hearing laughter, and dreaming quietly flashed through me. Each one was a rung on a ladder I had built myself. And at that moment, I knew the girl who once served at the table now had her seat, fully, undeniably, and with a calm that made no one dare challenge her. Even Mrs. Beaumont, polished and practiced in arrogance, had to acknowledge it, if only silently. Power, after all, doesn't always need to be shouted. Sometimes it's the quiet presence, the measured words, the confidence born from knowing every crack and corner that wins the day. The mansion breathed around me, familiar and respectful. And I, once invisible, had become impossible to ignore. The deed in my hand, The day I finally held the deed, my fingers trembled, not from fear, but from recognition. This was more than paper. It was the sum of years of whispers, of scraped knees and polished floors. The same marble I had once knelt upon to clean, now reflected a future I had earned. I remember stepping into the sunlight outside the mansion, clutching the folded document against my chest. The wind was crisp, carrying scents of autumn leaves and faint smoke from a distant fire. I inhaled deeply and allowed myself a quiet laugh, the kind that doesn't disturb anyone, but vibrates inside. "Look at us," I whispered to the house, finally together. Mrs. Beaumont was waiting inside, her posture stiff, her hands pressed lightly to her skirt. She looked at me like someone staring at a stranger who had wandered in through a dream. "You bought it?" she said, voice brittle. "Yes," I said simply, letting the words settle between us. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. She could feel it, taste it even, the quiet authority of ownership. I ran my hand over the edge of the marble countertop, imagining the years it had witnessed, the countless hours of my labor. I thought of every insult, every smirk, every whispered joke about the help dreaming too much. And now, all of it had been folded into this moment, polite trouble turned tangible. I signed the final papers in the lawyer's office, the pen scratching decisively across the page. Each stroke was a heartbeat, a promise fulfilled. When I finally set the pen down, I held the document to my chest and exhaled slowly. The smell of ink and polished wood was intoxicating. Driving back to the mansion, I passed the same streets I had once navigated timidly, mop in hand. Now, my car was sleek, and my hands rested confidently on the steering wheel. I chuckled softly at the irony. I had spent years polishing floors for someone else, only to drive past them in a car I could call my own. Inside the house, I walked through the rooms deliberately. The halls seemed to stretch, welcoming me as the rightful owner. Each crack, each chip, each smudge of smoke from the fire, they no longer spoke of neglect, but of survival and transformation. The house had endured, and now so had I. I could see the staff who remained, lingering with cautious curiosity. I smiled gently at them. "We'll work together," I said, "but remember, this is my home now." There was no malice, only calm authority. Polite trouble, perfected over years, can be far more intimidating than anger. I found myself lingering in the old study, the room that had burned, yet survived. I ran my fingers over the scorched wood, tracing the lines as if reading a familiar map. It was mine now, all of it, and for the first time in my life, the walls reflected my light, not just theirs. Later that evening, I poured a cup of tea, the steam curling upward like smoke in the morning sun. Sitting by the window, I watched the mansion breathe in the golden light, and I realized something profound. Power is quiet, patient, and elegant. It doesn't need to shout to be recognized. I whispered to myself, a soft, almost Asmer-like hum. "We made it, old friend." The mansion, scarred yet steadfast, seemed to acknowledge me, and I, once a girl kneeling on polished marble, had learned how to stand, finally, fully, and without apology. The commercial. It was strange walking through my own mansion with a film crew, cameras on tripods, lights dangling like captive stars, and a director barking instructions that somehow reminded me of my old bosses. Only this time, I didn't flinch. I walked confidently, heels clicking softly against the marble I once scrubbed. "This room catches the light beautifully," the director said, adjusting a reflector. I smiled politely, but inside, I was amused. Beautiful, yes, but not as much as the story beneath the walls. The crew buzzed around, setting up shots in the grand foyer, the library, and the study that had survived fire. They didn't know I had memorized every crack, every stain, every hidden corner over years of silent observation. Every frame was my playground now. I paused at the staircase, remembering the night I first discovered the hairline crack. Now it gleamed under the studio lights, transformed into a feature rather than a flaw. I allowed myself a quiet chuckle, the subtle humor of life finally making sense. "Walk down the stairs slowly," the director instructed, graceful, like you belong. I did, slowly, deliberately, letting the camera catch my movements. But I didn't just walk. I glided, polished floors, polished history, polished ambition beneath my shoes. A subtle victory smile crossed my face, unseen by most, but enough to mark the moment. During a break, the crew wandered into the kitchen. I watched them handle silverware with care, unaware that decades ago, I had been trained to notice every smudge, every fingerprint. My thoughts drifted. What a perfect irony that now they were the students in my old classroom. When the director yelled, "Action," I moved through the halls as if the house had always been mine. The cameras captured the chandeliers, the fire-damaged study, the soft reflection of sunlight on marble. Everything told a story of transformation, resilience, and quiet power. I remembered a joke I once whispered to myself while polishing floors. One day, I'll walk through these halls, and someone will call me Mayam instead of girl. The humor was still there, light and wry, as I acknowledged how literal it had become. By the end of the day, I stood in the grand foyer, watching the crew pack up. The mansion was quiet again, breathing softly after a day of orchestrated chaos. And in that calm, I let myself feel it fully, the satisfaction of long patience, the thrill of hard-won authority, and the serene amusement at how life had turned the tables. I whispered to the walls, my voice almost a lullaby, from mop to mansion, from shadow to owner. We've come a long way, haven't we? And the house, like an old friend, seemed to murmur back in the gentle creak of floorboards and the subtle sway of chandeliers. I laughed softly, a sound like a quiet bell, polite, elegant, victorious. And then I moved toward the library, already planning the next chapter. Sitting in the study that had survived fire, dust, and neglect, I allowed myself a long, deep breath. The mansion smelled of polished wood, lingering candle wax, and a faint trace of old books, scents that had once been intimidating, now comforting. I had come full circle, from mop in hand to owner of the very halls that once defined my servitude. Every step echoed with the rhythm of my patience and ambition. I ran my fingers along the desk, remembering the letter I had found years ago, the same one that whispered secrets of debt and opportunity. Back then, it had been a spark. Now, it was a memory, proof of a journey that no one else could rewrite. I chuckled softly, imagining the faces of those who had mocked me. Polite amusement danced through me. No anger remained, only satisfaction and a subtle, quiet humor. Walking through the mansion, I traced my former routes, the staircase I had polished countless times, the foyer where I had once crouched, invisible. The cracks in the marble no longer symbolized neglect, but survival. The fire-scarred walls weren't damage but history, reminders that even devastation could be transformed into opportunity. The staff who remained looked at me differently now, their respect quiet but evident. I smiled warmly, offering instructions gently, allowing them to feel part of something greater than themselves. Polite authority, learned in the silent shadows of servitude, was far more effective than command. One afternoon, while reviewing plans for restoring the burned study, I overheard Mrs. Beaumont talking to herself in the next room. Her voice was low, tinged with defeat and perhaps a hint of admiration. I didn't need to intervene. Sometimes the presence of power speaks louder than words. I found myself laughing softly, 3 times in quick succession, first at the irony of my journey, then at a memory of tripping over a mop handle, and finally at the realization that my reflection now looked entirely different in the same mirrors that once reflected my invisibility. The humor was subtle, light, Aasimar-like, curling around me in gentle waves. Evening settled into the mansion like a slow exhale. I poured a cup of tea and sat by the window, listening to the faint hum of the city beyond. The marble reflected the warm light, the chandeliers glimmered faintly, and the house seemed to sigh, content, or perhaps just acknowledging the rightful owner finally standing quietly at its center. I thought about the journey, The endless scrubbing, the secret notebooks, the careful listening, the deals made in whispers, the careful acquisition of property, and the eventual holding of the deed that transformed a girl into a force quietly impossible to ignore. Each moment had led to this, a perfect balance of patience, strategy, and gentle humor. The mansion and I were partners now. I understood it deeply, and it understood me. The marble floors, the fire-scarred study, the creaking stairs, they all had stories, and now I would write the next chapter. But for tonight, I let the house breathe, let myself breathe, and allowed the soft satisfaction of a long-awaited victory to settle in. A final thought whispered through me, soft as silk. The girl who once scrubbed floors had returned, not as a shadow, but as light, quiet, deliberate, and infinitely unstoppable.